Welcome to the fifth and final video in this sort of short mini-series, if you will, on the dialogue editor and how to use dialogues in RPG in a Box. So in the subsequent video, the previous one, we took a look at creating quest dialogue and other sort of examples of dialogue, like, for example, do you have a high enough skill, in which case a certain dialogue option appears, that kind of thing. In this video, we're going to take a look at scripting dialogue. So few things we're going to cover. We're going to cover two script functions related to dialogue, set dialogue and start dialogue, and something that you need to know about with start dialogue. I'm also going to quickly talk about something you really need to know about assigning scripts and dialogues to NPCs. And then at the very end, we'll talk about how to script dialogue outside of the dialogue editor using the script editor. And I'm going to reveal the true secret, if you will, behind the dialogue editor. Okay? So, with that said, let's get started. So let's start by taking a look at two scripting functions that are available to you when you're using script. How to set dialogue and start dialogue. So let's say we create a dialogue for a moment. Let's just close those and start a whole new dialogue, which we'll call script dialogue, and we'll click NPC to start with. Okay, and we'll just type hello player, and we'll just put hello NPC. Okay, just a quite simple dialogue, because it's not necessarily about the dialogue editor anymore, but we just need a dialogue file that we can set and start. Okay, so let's save that and let's go to the script editor and let's make a couple of scripts. Well, actually one script. So let's say, for example, we want a situation where when we walk on a tile, we want to assign a script to an NPC and then start dialogue. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll call this trigger dialogue. So we have two, let's do it by the visual editor. We have two functions available to us in the script editor to do with dialogue. So if we type dialogue into the search filter thing, the available functions filter, you can see we've got set dialogue and start dialogue. So let's first of all bring in set dialogue. So what this allows us to do is it allows us to set at runtime, so at any point in your game, you can set a specific dialogue file on an NPC. Now, we used this in the previous video to remove dialogue from an NPC at the end of a dialogue chain, but we also used it to change the dialogue as well at the end of a dialogue chain. But you can also obviously do it in scripts as well. So, outside of a dialogue, you can also change or set a dialogue. So the first parameter is the entity ID of the NPC who should have the dialogue set on them. So let's do Tom, for example. And then what's the dialogue that's going to get assigned to Tom? So you could say none if you wanted to remove a dialogue, or we could say, in this case, script dialogue. So now he'll have that dialogue assigned to him. Okay. And then the next one we have is start dialogue. And it's very simple. It starts dialogue. So let's then start script dialogue, right? So let's save this script and let's go to the map editor and let's delete this tile here and put concrete tile in, just so we can visually see which tile has the script on it. We'll click on this. We'll scroll down to scripts, character enters tile, trigger dialogue. And that's going to do these two things when we walk on this tile. Okay, so let's save that and let's give this a test. One thing I want to do first, is I want to click on Tom and remove his dialogue. So it starts with no dialogue, so we can see the difference. So here we are in the game. If I hover over Tom, I can't talk to him. There's no interaction cursor at all. Okay, if I now walk onto this tile, it should both set the dialogue on Tom, but also start the dialogue. And there we go. We get hello player. and then we can respond with hello NPC. If we hover over Tom now, we can actually see that we've got a cursor, a speech bubble. So we could now actually go and directly talk to Tom. And there we get Tom, hello player. And we get hello NPC. However, here's something important to know about start dialogue. Okay? Notice how if I talk to Tom, if I click on Tom directly, we get his portrait and we get his name because he's the initiating NPC. Okay? But what happens if I trigger this, the script? What if I walk onto this tile and start the dialogue? No portrait, no name, just hello player. Who's saying that? Apparently nobody is saying that. It's just a generic message. However, ours has a portrait and a name because obviously we are the player, right? So the player node is always relevant to the player. But in this case, because we're triggering the dialogue via a script, there's actually no initiating NPC because we're initiating it not from the NPC directly, we're initiating it from a script that's actually on a tile. So if you want to do that, if you want to talk to Tom, but remotely, i.e. the dialogue is triggered remotely. So let's say, for example, it's during a cutscene. So character walks up to the player and then you have start dialogue, right? Well, we need the NPC to still be the one that's saying the dialogue. So here's the thing to know about when you are using scripts that start dialogue, okay? The dialogue that's being triggered, in this case, script dialogue, you need to go into the dialogue itself and you need to change this. This cannot be initiating NPC because if you trigger it remotely via a script, it will not have an initiating NPC, so this will just be a generic message. So instead what you do is you have to specify that when this dialogue gets scripted, when this dialogue gets started via a script, who is it that should be saying these particular things inside this dialogue file? So every NPC node has to be filled in via the entity ID. So Tom in this case. So now because I've specified in this dialogue file that all the NPC nodes, so let's add another one quickly, just for example's sake. This should also be Tom. Okay, so every time we have an NPC node, it cannot be initiating NPC if it's going to be triggered via a script. Okay. And it doesn't matter if we set entity ID, even if we initiate the dialogue with the NPC, it's going to make no difference. But if you are going to trigger it via script, you do have to change it from initiating NPC. Okay. So now if we play the game one more time and we walk on the tile, now we can see that Tom's portrait and Tom's name shows up because we've specified that this is the NPC that should be saying these things when we trigger that dialogue. So that's an important distinction to know about the difference between triggering a dialogue directly from an NPC and triggering dialogue from a script. Is you need to go into the dialogue file itself and ensure that all your NPC nodes are specifically stating who it is that should be saying it via the ID. Otherwise, when you trigger the dialogue via the script, all those NPC field or nodes will have no parent. They'll be unassigned to an NPC. Okay. And there we go. We got another one. Nice to see you. And again, portrait and name shows up because again, we specified that that NPC node should have an entity ID assigned to it. If we'd left it as initiating NPC, then that would have been just the text, nice to see you, with no portrait. Okay. So another thing that's important to know about assigning scripts and dialogue to NPCs. Okay. If we click on Tom, for example, and we go into his properties, if we scroll down to where it says when player interacts, you'll see that we have a couple of options. Do nothing, or to be more precise, 4 options, but we have do nothing, start dialogue, start battle, or run script. Okay. So dialogue and scripts are 2 completely separate activities. Okay. So let's say, for example, we have a script on Tom, okay? And let's quickly go to our trigger dialog script and we'll amend that. So we'll save that. So you can see the parchment icon above Tom's head. That means he's got a script assigned to him. So what we'll do is we'll delete these and let's create a quick script where when we click on Tom, let's have something happen first. Let's have, let's think, what could we have happen? Let's just do damage entity, okay? And we'll damage the player by 2 health, okay? So every time we click on every time we click on Tom, we're going to get damaged by 2 health. It's just a quick example of something happening when you click on Tom, okay? That's all. That's why we're doing this. It's just to show something happening, okay? But then after that, what we'll do is we'll also set dialogue on Tom. We could use self because we're actually going to put this on Tom directly. Doesn't matter which one. Let's just do guard goblin, let's say, okay? That should be not in speech marks. So if this is in speech mark, if this is in speech marks, it's not going to work. So we have to edit this. We'll click the padlock is another way of doing it. Delete the speech marks and write it in like that. It should be in yellow, okay? And it should be a tick there. So set dialogue, self, guard goblin, okay? Now let's run the game and see what happens. So if we go and click on Tom, notice how our cursor is an interact cursor. So if we click on Tom, we just get dealt 2 damage, okay? But now if we hover our cursor over Tom, we now have a speech bubble instead of an interact cursor, okay? And if we click on Tom now, instead of damaging us, we get a dialogue, okay? And that's because the dialogue has replaced the script, okay? So it's impossible to have a script and a dialogue on an NPC at the same time on their interacts. You could have a script where near and a dialogue on interacts, for example. You could have let's go back to the map editor so I can show it. You can have a script on this one and dialogue on this one, for example. You can separate them out. But on the same one, when player interacts, it can only either be a script or a dialogue. So if the script that you have on an NPC sets a dialogue at any point on that NPC, this script will no longer run because it will now have effectively switched this over to start dialogue. Okay, does that make sense? Because the script, this one, is at the very end of it setting a dialogue on the same NPC, it effectively changes this one when player interacts to that and the dialogue you set instead. Okay, so then when you interact with them afterwards, it's always just going to do this. So if your script is supposed to be checking for the state of things while having a dialogue, you're going to have issues with that. So instead of, if that's what you want to do, if you want, for example, a script where you check if you've completed the quest, and then if you have, play one dialogue, if you haven't, play another, then to do that, instead of setting dialogue, so let's just put a practical script together. Let's put an evaluate condition in. If global property equals true, let's just say that was the property. Then if it is true, instead of set dialogue, you would start dialogue. Okay, so start that dialogue if you have completed the quest. Otherwise, start that dialogue if you haven't. Okay, so rather than setting the dialogue based on the decisions, because the moment you set a dialogue, it's going to completely not use this script at all and just use that dialogue. So if you need dialogue that changes based on, a condition in a script, then don't use set dialogue because that will replace the script. Use start dialogue and specify the dialogue that should start based on the outcome of the property check. Does that make sense? So now let's take a look at how to script dialogue outside the dialog editor using the Visual Script Editor. We'll talk a little bit about why you might want to do this and the benefits of doing this, as well as explaining how to do it. So let's first of all start with something you may not realize about the dialog editor. So if we go into a dialog, it doesn't matter which one, let's just open this one. Let's open up a bit more of a advanced one. Here we go. So there's nothing that the dialog editor does that a script can't do, plus more. Obviously, the script editor can do a lot more, because the script editor is basically where you make everything in your game happen, whereas the dialog editor is just for, making dialogue. But everything the dialog editor can do, the script editor can also do. And I just want to quickly sort of demonstrate that by going through each of these nodes here, showing you where they are in the script editor. Okay, so let's start with the NPC node. How do you create an NPC node, if you will, in the script editor? So let's create a new script called scripted dialog. And let's add in, let's do it via the Visual Script. We have this, okay? Every script you make by default starts with a display message, and this is the node that you would need for, this is the function, sorry, you would need for an NPC node. So this would be the message that the NPC says, so hello player, something like that. And then what you would do is you would set this to character, and then you could either set this to self if it's a script run on an NPC, therefore that would then be the NPC, or you can specify entity by ID, and this would also be how you could have an NPC join a conversation, for example. So if we had an NPC with the ID Tom, then now Tom will say, hello player, okay? So that's how you create an NPC node. Player node is done by literally just changing this to player, clicking OK. And then you could say, hello, NPC, right? So already we've covered both the NPC and the player node, same function, display message. The difference is who's saying the message, okay? Now, obviously, when it comes to the player's response, we can also split that out into choices. So how do you do choices in the script editor? Well, there's actually a function for that called display choices. So this is the function that you would use for that. Once again, you can specify a character who says the above message, okay? We'll go into quick examples of these just before we close out. But for now, let's move on. But that is how you would do a split player choice. These would be your choices. This would be who says this message, okay? Then we have the message node. Well, quite plain and simply, that's a display message without a speaker. So you just say none. This will then be your world text, your narrator text, or your descriptive text, whatever you want to display. You stub or toe, that's how you would do your descriptive text, okay? So just have no speaker entity, okay? Next, we have the condition node. So these nodes here, these are done very simply with evaluate condition. You would use this. And again, you would specify your condition that you want to check for. So we could do, for example, self property equals true, so Boolean. This would then allow us to make this visited. So self property visited equals true. And then this would be the then path. This would be the else path. So you would just connect this up to display messages. You would connect this one up to different display messages. Okay. Now, unlike the dialog editor, although I think you probably can do it with the dialog editor, but it's just a lot easier here. You can then also have things that come out of the end node as well. So these could be things that are sort of outside of this condition. You can also have happen as well. We'll take a look at those in an example. Okay. But for now, that's how you do the condition node, if you will, in the script editor is using an evaluate condition. Next we have the script node. We don't need to worry about the script node because we're already in the script editor. We're already writing a script. Everything we're doing is a script. So in essence, whatever your script node would have done, so if we open up this one, for example, here we're doing, let's open this up and copy this. So here, for example, we're removing item, completing quest, setting a frame, setting a global property. All you would have to do is just have that literally straight in our dialog. So we'd have, a display message from, let's say self. And then we would have, let's say another message from the player. So that's display message, character, player. And then all you would do is just directly underneath your dialog, paste your code because it's already a script. So you just write it directly in the dialog script, right? Because you're already writing a script. So you almost don't need a script node because the whole thing is a script. Now, the only thing we don't natively have, if you will, in the script editor is a go-to function. There's no such thing as an actual thing we can drag into the script editor for go-to. But what we can do is we can make use of something called functions, custom functions. So I'll probably give an example of that when we get into, just quickly putting an example dialogue together so you can see, how it would work. But, while there isn't a native function for that, there is a technique that you can do in the script editor that basically creates the same effect of being able to jump around or repeat certain parts of your dialogue, okay? And then the last thing we have is comment nodes, which again, these are things that the player doesn't see. These would be notes you leave yourself. These are very easy to do in the script editor. You can just do 2 // and then whatever you write is not shown in game. It's only visible when you're editing the script. So again, you can leave yourself comments for your dialogue. So now I've shown you where each of these nodes are, if you will, in the script editor. Now let me talk about what are the advantages. Why would you want to write a dialogue in the script editor? What are the advantages to writing a dialogue in the script editor? Well, for me, the main advantage is that with the script editor, you have a lot more flexibility. You can move things around very easily. If you realize you need to put a piece of dialogue inside a condition, you can much easier do that in the script editor than you can in the dialogue editor. If you want to move any nodes around, like, I want this NPC to say this thing a bit earlier, or I want to change this whole piece of dialogue to happen earlier. It's so much easier with the script editor. You can, just copy paste text around, just literally, paste it like this. If this was a whole load of dialogue, you can just select it, copy it, move it somewhere else. It's just, you can work much faster. But as I say, you can also decide at a later date, actually, I want all of this to happen. Let's say this was dialogue, not script stuff for a moment. Let's say this was a whole load of display messages. I want a check, first of all, to make sure that I've set a global property set or something. So if global property, just type something for the moment, equals true, and then I would just basically wrap all of this inside that check. So now all of a sudden, what is a bit of a struggle to do in the dialogue editor has taken me like 2 seconds in the script editor. To do that in the dialogue editor, I would have had to create a new section, created a condition in the new section, and then moved every node one by one and restructure it in the second section. You've seen me show that previously in this series, right? In the script editor, I did it in 2 seconds, right? So there's a huge speed efficiency benefit to doing it in the script editor. Now, even if you're not familiar with the text side of things, don't forget, of course, you can always, let's just save that for a moment, although, will that work? No, because I didn't actually type anything valid, but let's just do if true. Okay, but if you were to apply, if you were to apply and save that, then you do have nodes that you can work with, right? So you can move these around, you can wire them up differently. Oh, I don't want that to happen. I want disconnect that. I want that to happen instead. So done straight away. So even in the visual script editor, you can work much more efficiently and faster than the dialogue editor. So these are the benefits to using the dialogue editor. The script editor, is you can just work a lot more efficiently, and you're not going to run into the issue of your dialogue, just struggling with the dialogue editor and it not sort of doing the things you want it to do, not placing the nodes where you want them to be and things like that. All of these problems kind of just go away if you just realize you can do it all in the script editor, right? The only thing that the dialogue editor, as far as I'm concerned, is it's just a user-friendly interface for the nodes I've just shown you in the script editor. The script editor is just a more advanced way of writing dialogue. Again, there's nothing the dialogue editor can do that a script can't do itself. So the script editor is just the advanced way of writing dialogue. And if you realize that if you're already proficient at writing scripts, you may as well write your dialogues in the scripts, because you're already, when it comes to, like, for example, checking if you've spoken to someone before, or when it comes to then having your your dialogue do things like give you a quest or complete a quest or give you an item, remove an item, you're already writing a script, so you can write that stuff straight in the dialogue, if you will, because it would just be immediately underneath all the dialogue nodes, right? So now a few things to bear in mind. Let's go through them now, because I haven't covered everything yet that we've covered in this series, so I do want to cover everything. So a few things to note. First of all, when it comes to these properties, like self-property visited equals true, one difference between the dialogue editor and the script editor, though, is that if we were to do that, let's create a quick script where we say if self-property visited equals true, then we'd have one branch of dialogue, else, then we'd have another branch of dialogue, end, right? None of these, let's just put, some dialogue in here just for a moment. This would obviously be comment. And then we'll also have different dialogue here. Okay. None of these two dialogues would play, because outside of the dialogue editor, these properties don't default to existing. So this is actually going to be remember how I said in the when I was talking about this property in the dialogue editor, where in the previous videos in this series, I said that this defaults to false at the start, right? That's only true in the dialogue editor, okay? Outside the dialogue editor, in this case, in the script editor, this actually defaults to null. There's nothing set. So because it's not false or true, none of these things are going to happen. Now, you could check for null, or another thing that you could do is just make sure that every self.property that you're going to use, do make sure in the map that you select the NPC that you're going to have this property on, including the visited property. So go to their custom properties and add it here. So any properties that you need, so let's say I needed 2 of them, okay? Let's say this one is visited. Now it's defaulting to false because that's what I've set it to. And let's say I need one called quest accepted, right? So you set those up beforehand so that your dialogue script can then use them, okay? Now that we have this property existing on the NPC called false, now this script will work. Now we can check for, is this true? It will default to false, so else will happen, okay? Now bearing in mind, of course, that this dialogue actually probably still would play even if it was null, because null is not true. But if you were checking for false and expecting that to be how the thing starts, then it's not going to be that either. So it's just important to know what this starts as. This does start as null and non-existent data outside of the dialogue editor. So that's why I bring it up, okay? Technically, this check would still work because it shouldn't be true to begin with, and sure enough, null isn't true, so it would do the else, but it wouldn't be false either. So if you were checking for false, that wouldn't happen. And if you're wondering why that isn't happening, even though it should be, that's because in the actual game, i.e. outside the dialog editor, in the script stuff, it doesn't start false, it starts null. And that's going to be the same for every property. So even if we then checked for, as I say, if self property quest accepted is true or is false, doesn't matter what you check for, by default, unless you set this property either in startup or in the NPC's settings, this will always be null, unlike the dialog editor where you're kind of setting it and checking it, with the nodes. With these scripts, you kind of need to make sure you are setting these up as well elsewhere, okay? You could, of course, set up all the properties you want in the same script, of course, but obviously you might not want to do that because you might not want them every time the script is run to be setting a default value, because it might be constantly resetting these. So, it's up to you how you declare these, but it's just important to know that you have to do that because unlike the dialog editor, these things don't default to being false to begin with. They default to being null. So just be aware of that, okay? You can still do placeholder expression with all of these. So for example, let's go to the script editor. Let's go to add a display message. So placeholder expression, we could still make this a dynamic bit of text. So $ open and close curly brackets, player.name, and that will now be a dynamic reference to the player's name. Now, one thing that's important to know about when you're doing placeholder expression inside quotation marks, which is what we're doing here, you need to be very careful if you're pointing your placeholder expression at a variable that already has quotation marks in it. For example, let's just write global property text, okay? No, let's say you had a global property called text, okay? Notice how the word text has suddenly appeared in white. That's because this isn't going to work. If I try and compile this, we'll probably get an error. Let me just make sure I put a semicolon. Let's try and apply. Yeah, so we get an error. Doesn't know how to handle this because, this isn't valid code. And the reason for that is because we've got two quotation marks, a beginning and an end. This is the opening quotation mark, but it's closing it here. It's seeing the quotation marks of the property name as the closing quotation marks of the display message, and then and then where we should be closing the global property name, it's seeing that as reopening the quotation marks of a display message and then closing it here. So it doesn't know what text in the middle, the bit in white, what's that for? What so it errors. So the way you have to deal with speech marks within speech marks, which is what these are nested speech marks, you have to put a backslash before each speech mark that's inside speech marks, okay? So these are still the main opening and closing speech marks. Every sort of quotation mark inside these two, has to have a backslash in front of it, so it doesn't actually get treated as a display message speech mark, if you know what I mean. It gets treated as the speech mark, quotes within a quote, yeah? So for example, if you had a character saying something like, Bob said hello to me the other day, okay? We want hello to be what Bob said. So in other words, we want to do that. Well, we've got the same problem, right? We've got somebody, in this case, the dialogue is Bob said hello to me the other day, but we also want to specify that what the NPC is saying is, in quotes, what Bob said in quotes. If I'm trying to make this make sense, but so we just want to make sure we make sure those particular quotes are treated purely as the message rather than the code, if that makes sense. So these quotation marks should be part of this message rather than be treated as the display message's functioning quotation marks. That's what the backslashes do. They basically say, don't treat these as actual code. It's kind of like saying treat them as comments. It's kind of like doing that. Yeah. So they'll be displayed. You'll see these quotation marks in game around the word hello. So it serves its function of being a quote. But in code, it doesn't actually try and end the display message and get all complicated and get itself confused. Okay. So bear that in mind with placeholder expression. You have to be a little careful when it comes to any variables that have quotation marks, such as global properties, entity properties, etc., because they'll have quotation marks for their names. You have to escape those quotation marks out. Okay. But you can, as you can see, do placeholder expression in the script editor. You can obviously also do the color stuff. So let's say hello is in green. Let's get rid of the quotation marks. And we can still do color equals 00FF00, close the brackets, color, and that would still then work as being green. For example, the word hello would be green. Okay. What else have we covered? So let's quickly go over putting a quick dialogue together, just so you can see some of the other things like player choice and go-to nodes. So let's just quickly throw something together. So let's start with an NPC node. So we'll drag a display message in and we'll set this to being said by self. Let's just have it say for now, hello player. Well, let's do placeholder expression there as well. So hello player.name, semicolon, and then we'll have another display message. So we'll just copy and paste. This can be the player's response. So we'll make this a player. And we can say, let's also do placeholder expression. Just to make life easier, I'm going to create a local variable at the top of this. Actually, what I might be able to do, let's see if I can do this. I have no idea if this is going to work, but it should do, if you think about it. Self.name. See if that works. So that should then be the name of the NPC we're talking to, because of the self. Let's have the NPC then ask us a question. So for this, what we need is display choices, okay? Because the question is going to lead directly into a choice. Let's just try and get that back. Display choices. Okay, so let's have him say something simple like, do you like my outfit? Okay, so that's going to be said by self. And then we can say yes, or we can say no. Okay. Let's get rid of choice number 3. Okay. Now, what you need to do with display choices, of course, is you need to store the result. So we need to say, let's say $result, for example, equals, and then the result of that choice. So then what you would do is you then use an evaluate condition, if you will. If $result equal to 0, then that would be the equivalent of us saying yes. So now we can have the NPC respond with thank you so much. And then you could have other things happen. Let's do a generic display message. So we'll just copy that for a second. Let's not have self. So this is just a generic world message. So 2 asterisks. He, for now, will just specify he looks at you very happy. Something like that. And then what you could do is say else in this case, because there's only 2 choices. But obviously, if there was more than 2 choices, you would do an else if $result equals 1, etc. But we'll just do else for now. So now you've said no. Then we could, for example, copy these. And he can say, who needs your opinion anyway? And then he looks at you very upset, and then ends. And that would be your, how to deal with the choice. Okay. Now, let's say you said that we don't like his outfit. At a later date, we might want to return to this choice. Okay. Now, one way you could do that is to literally copy this choice again and have it inside that particular path. However, another thing that you can do is just create a function at the top of your dialog. Let's call this function repeat dialog, begin, end. And in here, you would chuck all of the dialog that needs to repeat. So if we go up here, paste that into there. Oops, wrong minute, something happened there. We're supposed to include that line as well. Cut those, paste those into there. There's our function. Now, the thing to know about if you're going to do this, if you're going to put dialogue in functions, you need to specify the NPC rather than self, because self's not going to work inside a function, okay? Because they're kind of isolated things. So for these, we're going to have to specify an entity. Now, you could one thing you could do actually, just to make it more, that needs to be in brackets anyway. But what you could do is you could pass in an entity. Okay, you'd have to can't use that entity 1, for example, and then what you could do is use that as the speaker. So in this case, $entity1. So wherever you've got self, make sure you're using that this variable here, okay? And then that NPC will say it. So then whenever in your dialogue, so this is your function of the things you want to repeat. So wherever you want that choice to come up, so let's say now, we can just call repeat dialogue and then specify entity, in this case, Tom. And now Tom will be entity 1, and that will be used in all of these. Okay, or we could even pass in self, thinking about it. So self would then become the entity 1. Okay. So then you'd have all of this. We could then now the beauty about doing it that way is that any dialogue that comes after this function, so let's say here, is separate to this repeating dialogue. So if you had, a different path, so let's say, for example, if self dot property mood equals happy, then do something else, okay? Let's say we had a bit of dialogue for when he's happy, but part of that dialogue is to call this function with self. What we can then do is have completely separate display messages related to happy that continue after these nodes. But then we could also, if he's not happy, call this function self, but then have entirely different nodes, let's say, for when he's unhappy. So you can have things that repeat, but also are different. Okay, and this would be how you would do that as well. That makes sense? So the other thing to talk about before we close out this particular topic is something to know about choices. So we've covered in the previous video conditional branches. So dialogue choices that only appear, for example, if you've got a high enough persuasion. Okay, let's quickly take a look at that. So to do that, you have to, let's take a look at the display choices for a second. You can see that the choices are an array. Okay, so knowing that, what you do is you check for, outside of the dialogue, you check for your stat. So for example, if, and let's build the array first. So let's say there's a couple of choices. Let's say he asks, do you like my outfit? Okay, let's say we create a choice array, and that equals array, and that has a yes in it, and it has a no in it. Okay, so then what we do is, let's say we want a third choice, which is a result of a high enough skill. So maybe if we've got a diplomacy skill or a, persuasion skill or something, there might be a bit of dialogue here where you can, convince him to give you his outfit or something. I don't know. Just trying to think of something that would fit this example, right? So what you would do is in order for that to be dynamic, i.e. it only appears if you've got that skill, is you would then do a check. If player.stat, let's say persuasion, seems if that's the example we've been going with in this series, equals greater than 50, then end. Then what you do is you then do $choice array dot push back. In other words, this piece of data will get added after the no, and then you push back your persuasion give me your clothes or whatever, right? And then that will, if that's the case, if this when your script checks that, if that's the case, then this text will essentially, let's just grab it, will essentially get added into this array like this, only if your stat is greater than 50. Otherwise, it will just have, the array will just have those two in it, okay? And then when it gets to your dialog, so later on when you actually do that, so do that at the top of your script, and then when it gets to the display choices part of your dialog for that, instead of calling the array in the display choices, you call $choice array, and you'll get the result. So it will either have two choices in it, or it will have three, depending on whether it was able to put, in this case, the third one in, okay? Now, obviously, when it gets to storing that, so you have $result, for example, equals display choices. When it comes to checking that, you'll need to check how many, how big the array is, if you know what I mean. So, because obviously, if the player stat persuasion was less than 50, there'd only be two things inside this array, yes and no. But if your stat is greater than 50, there'll now be three things in the array, right? So you can't guarantee that the array is always going to be two things or three things, all right? When it gets to the dialog, it could have had one thing in it, or it could have had three things in it. So just before you store the actual dialog inside the result, just, do a check for the size of the array, check if it's got two things in it or three things in it, just so you make sure you don't get any errors about, checking for a third entry when there isn't one, right? So you just need to obviously, again, I'm assuming that you already are familiar with scripting. If you're not familiar with scripting, then this whole video is probably going to be a bit too advanced for you anyway. If you're just here to look at dialogues and you haven't yet touched scripting, obviously, why would you write dialogues in script at this stage anyway, okay? But this is just to show you, if you are familiar with the script editor, but you may not be aware that you can do dialogues in the script editor, this is how you do it. So hopefully I've helped sort of illuminate the ability of writing scripts in the script editor, writing dialogue, in the script editor, and why you might go about doing that. Anyway, that, as I say, brings us to the end of this series on the dialogue editor and dialogues in general. If you have any questions that you might have after watching this series, do feel free to reach out on the Discord. For now, that will wrap this course up. Hope you got a lot of use out of it and a lot of good information, and I hope it's helped. So with that said, that'll wrap this series up. Thanks for watching.